Hello and welcome to today's episode of Leadership in Extraordinary Times. I'm Professor Andrew Stephen, the Research Dean and the L'Oreal Professor of Marketing here at Oxford University's Said Business School. Wherever you are in the world, thanks for joining us, and I hope you're healthy and safe in these extraordinary times. One of the obvious impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic and the lockdowns, such as the one we're in at the moment here in England, is the shift, out of necessity obviously, from people working in offices to working from home. Today's episode is going to think about this from a real estate perspective. What is the future of the office? Will we ever go back to working in our offices, or are we in the midst of a permanent shift in behaviour and physical ways of working? With a lot of empty, currently unused commercial real estate sitting now in the world's cities, business districts, office parks and suburbs, what happens next is going to be really important. And who better to think about these important issues than today's expert panel? We're joined by Professor Andrew Baum, who's the Professor of Practice here at Oxford Said and the Director of the Oxford Future of Real Estate Initiative. Sabina Kalyan, who's Global Chief Economist and Co-Global Head of Research for CBRE Global Investors, and also an Associate Fellow here with us at Oxford Said. Ronan Giorno, former Senior Vice President for Enterprise and Workplace at WeWork, and Arsha Kazazayan, Director of Global Real Estate for Shearman and Sterling LLP. So many thanks to all of you for spending your time with us today. And to you, our audience, please remember to post your questions in the Q&A box so that our panel can get to them throughout this broadcast. And on that note, I think it's time for me to now hand it over to my colleague, Professor Andrew Baum, who's going to kick off this discussion. Over to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Andrew, and welcome to you all from Oxford. It's great to have got a panel like this together to talk about a topic which I know has been talked about a lot, but I think you'll hear some new things this afternoon. Delighted to include Ronan Giorno, who's now working as European Head of Operations for Hines, which is one of the top 5 real estate managers globally, and particularly well known for its office developments and its office management. So we have a great guy here, and Ronan used to be at WeWork, which we've all heard of. Arsha Kazazian is Director of Global Real Estate for an Occupier, so she'll have a perspective from the Occupier, and we'll hear some insights on how occupiers are thinking about the future of the office. I'll be talking about some research that we're doing, which is trying to think slightly more theoretically and empirically at the same time about the future of the office. So instead of lots of opinion, we need to get to grips with some numbers, and we're trying to do that. We'll be talking to you about our modelling. And then finally, Sabina Kalyan will look at it from the investor's perspective. How do investors look at the future of offices? Are they investable, or are we running for the exits? So thanks to all of you for sharing your views with us today. So the first thing we're going to do, the pattern for the session is we have an hour. We'll be finished by 3 o'clock UK time. We'll take no longer than 25 to 30 minutes maximum to make 4 presentations. They'll be reasonably brief and sharp. We'll then have a panel discussion which will carry on for 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll have at least 15 minutes at the end to deal with your questions, which hopefully will be coming through on the Q&A function. So we really look forward to those questions. And before we get to that, then I think the kickoff will be Ronan. So Ronan, delighted to involve you in this conversation, and let's look at your slides.
Sure. Thank you so much, Andrew, for the invitation. And the slides on screen.
So Fred, we need the presentation up. There we go.
All right. So first of all, a massive thank you for the invitation. I have just entered the Hines family world. Literally, this is day 7. So sincerely appreciate the invitation. And if we can just jump into the next slide, please. What I would like to share is really some insights that have been gathered over the past 7-8 months through fairly extensive dialogue, and really credit needs to go to WeWork to enable me to crystallize those thoughts and engage with a vast number of leaders across the world. All are large occupiers, all dealt with the crisis, all dealt with return to the office and not return to the office, and most importantly, are now trying to formulate what are the right plans for their organization, for their culture, for their industry, as we're thinking about the medium term beyond COVID. So if we can please move on to the next slide. These are the kind of companies that I have spoken to. So they really are across all sectors, from heavy manufacturers to professional services, banks, regulated, unregulated, less regulated. So really across the board and also across the globe. And it was really fascinating. What I would like to share here is really just a very brief summary of some of those insights. If we can please move to the next slide. So as we prepare for life beyond COVID, as larger occupiers are thinking, this has been the greatest change agent to the world of work and to the world of real estate that we've probably seen in a century. I'm not professing to have the answers as to what the world of work would look like or how radical the impact of offices will be, but there are some common themes and ingredients that I'd like to share with you. So the first one is, I'm a firm believer that the office is definitely not dead. We're going to see people repurposing core strategic locations in their portfolios. They will repurpose them to become collaboration locations where people congregate, where they do business, and where people can feel a sense of belonging to the brand and the values of the company they work for. And with that, I am a firm believer that we will see the cities coming back. Despite what we are witnessing in London, I think we will see the cities thrive. And equally, I think we're going to see a renaissance of the commuter towns as people are given choice to spend some more time away from the heart of city centers. What I think is really fascinating is the debate that we have seen in a number of European countries, in particular in Germany, between what the government wants to introduce and legislate versus what large occupiers such as Siemens and others have introduced. And that is, who becomes liable for home ergonomics? What are the tax implications of people working from home? What is the role of the union in protecting employee welfare when all of a sudden they work anywhere? And with that, what do we do to the contracts of employment? Especially in Germany, in France, where contracts of employment are very, very detailed in relation to the conditions of work. It's also fascinating to hear many corporates saying, we are revisiting workforce plans. Today, the world has truly become flat. And through technology, we are really able to tap into talent and skills across the globe. So they are no longer the mindset barriers that we may have had a year ago about where to hire talent. And this is fascinating to hear in the pharmaceutical industry and in some organizations that perhaps are covering particular continents such as South Africa and the rest of the African region. But if we can move to the next slide, please. So a few more of these ingredients. There is no doubt that the longer this lockdown, release from lockdown is lasting, and we're almost a year into it, I think we are all going to attach far greater value to the time we spend commuting and time we spend, meeting people physically together. So therefore, I think that the way that people actually behave in the world of work will adjust once we get through this. It's very clear that CFOs and heads of real estate are thinking, what are the right sets of matrix for this blended world? So we're going to retain the productivity matrix, efficiency, effectiveness matrix that we had in the past. But now as we enter a blended world, what else do we need to capture about experience of employees and performance of employees? There's a lot of debate in the industry about how to repurpose an office and the fact that we need to actually unpeel the onion and look at what activities humans perform. Is it about cognitive? Is it about creative? Is it about collaborative? So what are the specific behavior that we actually perform in a space? And how do we meet that with the way we design offices? The final thing that I would just add here, there was actually a professor in a London Business School who coined this, I think, and I have to copy it. He said, early on in a crisis that technology has actually democratized, humanized, and informalized work. And if you think about it, for almost 12 months, it doesn't matter whether you're the CFO, CEO of the company, or the most junior graduate, you've all become a square on a screen, and you have become, another voice. So the old world symbols of space have disappeared. The executive floor, the corner office, the additional assistants outside, they've all disappeared. And that has a huge cultural impact on companies and the way we use space and offices. What of those old world symbols would we like to take to the future? So just to close, if I may share the next slide. I've expressed my views that I'm trying to crystallize multiple times in the last 6 months, and I'm a really firm believer that the future of work is here. We have all now become, digital natives at all age groups. We are talking about humanity. We are talking about mental illnesses. We are talking about relationships. We're talking about what really matters. But we're also very conscious that we need data. We need data on the market. We need data on productivity before we jump into conclusions and formulate new plans of how to use space. But I do believe that the future will be about choice and trust, and it will be about quality, and it will be about experience. And in many ways, large occupiers will continue to consume space from WeWork and IWG and others, as well as have their own strategic locations. And I don't think it's a binary conversation of home or office. I do think it's this rich ecosystem of destinations and settings when you actually go to an office. That's it for me. Thank you for the opening.
Great, Ronan. Thank you. Thank you very much. Hopefully we'll have time for questions for you later on, and we'll be engaging with you later in a conversation. So Arsha, over to you.
Thank you. And again, just like Ronan, very much appreciate including me in the panel. Much of what Ronan said obviously resonated with me as I represent an occupier. It's incredibly interesting because Ronan actually mentioned something about peeling the onion back. And majority of my presentation is going to focus on that because I think we're in a tremendous reevaluation period as an occupier looking outward to the owner and the asset to say, what is the real purpose of this asset? What is my relationship with my landlord? What is the intrinsic value of the asset that I occupy? Why did I choose to locate myself in that area? And then how do the people who actually occupy it feel before and after? And I think this period of evaluation is an incredible opportunity. It is the greatest silver lining that COVID could have provided for us because it allowed us to do a reset and to really think more clearly about what we want in our lives, what our purpose is, and to start to make demands as an employee in a space with your employer, and also for that to then feed up to the tenant demanding certain things from the landlord. And so to not look at in varying scales of these relationships and these dynamics and these shifting values, and then understand how can we create mutually beneficial rewards from those relationships and from those developments, I think would be a tremendous disservice for us. And I think we're all talking about the same thing, just coming at it from a different angle. So as an occupier, I think about, next slide, please. I think about this slide. So I've had this on hand for quite some time. It's always made me chuckle. But what I think is so interesting is that I think it speaks to the shifting KPIs and the benchmarks that I think half of them we can now toss in the garbage, because there was a notion, I think, for many industries around the globe that if you didn't show up to work, you were not working. And many industries, I would say more on the financial services, legal services side where I work, and others on the periphery of those two industries, and the clients that they served had that belief, they maintained that belief. And COVID shook that up. And so you can go to the next slide. So what I wanted to do for a second, before I dive in and expand on the different modalities of work that we're now going to analyze as a tenant, is to kind of give you a snapshot or a glimpse into what we went through in March. So in March, we went into lockdown. I manage about 1 million square foot portfolio, about 23 offices around the globe. Each have a very distinct way of working. Each have a very distinct set of policies or legislation that they have been impacted by. And so, like most of my counterparts who I sat with for hours kind of sharing intel as to what do we do first, we kind of ironed out what the general considerations are. And I will not go through this in its entirety, but just to kind of give you a sense, we had what's the immediate response in terms of communication to our employees. Then there was the short-term planning to say, okay, now we need to engage our landlords, and this is around the globe. And then the medium and the long-term captures consideration, strategies, and planning around all of these different aspects. So you have the business planning aspects, which immediately triggers an evaluation at the leadership level to say, who are we, what do we believe, and what are we missing now? The workplace optimization, this is really, I think, central to our conversation today. But these are the activities where everyone was scrambling. You're looking at your head counts. You're saying, are you oversupplied, undersupplied? What are the give back options? What are the lease break options? Are there deferral options with rent, abatement options with rent? And also starting to look back and say, did I just sign a 30-year lease? And I will never do that again. And so that completely changes the relationship of the company to the space that they have now just put in some, upwards of, $50 to $100 million to build a headquarters that is going to, in some way, magically create the culture of a company. And so all of that's gotten shaken up. And so immediately you start seeing in the news from March to June, the press is going crazy and saying there's a hub and spoke model. There's this model. This is what people are looking at. There's a public shaming kind of going on with large anchor tenants who are looking for abatements. And so there's all these activities happening during this period. And so what comes of that? What comes of it is that, and you can go to the next slide. So what comes of that, I think, is, and this is just very high level, and I know Ronan and Sabina, both of you are far more in this conversation than I am in terms of looking at it at an industry level. But if you look below, there are two sort of buckets that we're looking at. So if you look at the TAMI industries, tech, advertising, media, and information, they typically have been far more in the center of a capital-centric planning model than a human-centric. And they have shifted now even more so in response to COVID at a rate that is far greater. The financial and legal services typically are the laggards. And with the technology adoption that has been required to perform their daily duties, they have also been forced to make considerations to their employees where choice is now a factor, as well as health, safety, and well-being. So we can go to the next slide because I know we're running out of time. This is a very quick just exhibit, like many surveys that are out there, but I found this one incredibly compelling. This is an emotional response across 1,000 companies across sectors that effectively show you two things. The survey shows that what people miss most about work, and this supports everything that Ronan shared, is that 60% of them miss seeing people and their colleagues. So this is about community building. This is about human interaction. This is about hugging and laughing and sharing and showing your family photos to one another and watering each other's plants. That's what that's about. Then 4%, at the opposite end of the spectrum is they miss their workspace. So I think that says it all. Just another statistic, and we can go to the next slide. Just another quick statistic, and Sabina and Ronan, you're probably seeing this too, about somewhere between 40 and 42% of employees wish to remain to work from home, and or some hybrid version where they're working from home 2 to 3 days a week. So what does that say? So what we're going to see here in the next 2 slides, and then we'll close and we can talk about it later, is that the greatest focus has been, and dollars have been spent and capital expenditures have been made towards creating spaces for focused work. It's very expensive real estate. And the reason why that is because oftentimes when we have these cellular offices, so dedicated offices, those offices become second to one's home. So you bring your creature comforts to the office, and to create an environment where you feel safest in your private space. That is very expensive. If that model changes and now all of your creature comforts have now remained at the home, then when you come to work, it's not to be with yourself, it is to be with others. And so there's a huge shift in emphasis. So we can go to the next model. And so this is what we're proposing, where the world is heading. This completely aligns with what Ronan had shared prior. It expands on it greatly. And effectively, what we're looking at is spaces that can be created to solve problems instead of segregating the focused work and collaborative spaces that we are typically accustomed to seeing. Really addressing wellness and inclusion by creating a sense of community that invites all, not few. And that is a subject that is quite current, as we all know, and really starts to drive innovation. So you have different modalities of thinking, and in that, in physically creating spaces that serve this model or similar model, you will find that you can optimize your portfolio at a much more rapid and more successful way. And that's the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Asha. Thank you. If we can move on to the next slide, then we can focus on my presentation, which is simply one slide, and trying to put into hard economics what Ronan and Asha have been describing is difficult. You know, there is no model for this yet, and we've started to develop this in the Future of Real Estate Initiative. And in order to make any real hard forecasts about the way the future is going to be, we really need data. So we need to measure the impacts of pretty much all of these boxes. So if you just explain this model from the start, the proposition is that there'll be more home working. I think Asha's feels particularly strongly about that. I think Ronan isn't disagreeing. But Ronan is also pretty clear that we will be returning to the office. So we're likely to end up with some sort of model where we're balancing homework with the traditional office. So the question then is going to become, how much more home working will there be, and how much space will that release? How much cost will that save for the user of the office space? And Asha was saying that no longer will we sign 30-year leases. Okay, so we'll be taking less space, more flexible space, whatever. If we are able to move to more home working, will that result in more space being provided in CBD offices per worker? You know, so in other words, no economic benefit, because the space that's saved will simply be reallocated to collaboration space, better quality space. Or will occupiers actually reduce their CBD costs? Will they save rent, business rates, property taxes, utility costs? And if they do that, where does that money go? So that's the next level down. So if there are savings in costs, where will that money go? Will it lead to more profits for Shearman and Sterling? Will it lead to higher salaries for the staff? Or will it go into third space costs, something that we've not talked about yet? So my proposition is that home working is not satisfactory in the long run. for a lot of people. A lot of people with children without dedicated space, you know, it's going to be difficult for them to do it. So they will be looking for somewhere else to go to work if it's not in the CBD office. And therefore we see the rise of propositions for third space cost, you know, distributed, flexible co-working spaces. So will some of the money be used by some of the cost savings, will that be reallocated to third space costs in suburban office locations, commuter towns, and so on? If the money goes into salary, which it may have to, where will that money be spent? And the money might be spent in housing costs. So, for example, employees might go to their employers and say, I'm now working from home, you're going to save costs in the office. I need to have a fourth bedroom, I need to have an office in the garden, I need to have a study, I'm going to have to spend more on housing costs, I need more salary. Or alternatively, I'm going to have to spend more on commuting because I'm going to have to go further to get bigger housing that's going to give me the suitable space to work from home. Or maybe the cost of third space provision will fall on the employee. So maybe the employee says, look, I'm going to choose not to work from home, I'm going to choose to work in a third space, and I need that cost to be subsidized or supplemented in my salary. And there's another possibility, of course, and that is that the employee requires support from his employer that I've just received in the post, for example. Here's a microphone that was sent to me by my university. Here's a webcam that was sent to me by university, and here's something else. I don't understand what that is yet. But anyway, I've just received this package from Amazon from Oxford University because they're having to pay for me to be better connected at work. So that's another use of the economics. And then all of that is in a steady state productivity world. What happens if productivity falls as a result of home working? Then, you know, the feedback loop says, well, we're not going to provide any revenue gain here. We're simply going to lose revenue because we're going to be less productive. Therefore, none of this money is available to be spent on extra housing or on third space costs. We're just not going to have that money. Or alternatively, do you think that actually productivity will increase as a result of home working, in which case more money goes into the system to pay for third space costs? And, you know, I don't know the answer to any of these questions. What I'm saying is we're now collecting data that will try to measure these. All I can say is that the early work that we've done suggests that it's going to be extremely difficult to make third space costs profitable, whether they're funded by the employer or funded by the employee. They're going to be very hard to make work. So it's a big open question. It's work we're doing. I'd love to hear from Sabina now to think about how she talks about, or she thinks about, the future of the office market from the investor's point of view. Is it all over?
Is it all over? I mean, an important thing to say is that we don't really have a horse in the race. We're an investor, we can allocate capital globally. So we're not part of the brokerage business. We're not sort of tied to office development. So we really can look at this very neutrally. And to a certain extent, as a landlord, it's about allowing corporate occupiers, when the pandemic feels like it's under control. I'm not sure if it ever necessarily is over, but we are now at least moving to a stage where it's about a logistics problem. How far that elastic band of behavior snaps back, as it might well do in Asia, or how far there is a permanent sticky behavioral change in how they want to use their offices. And Arsha has said very powerfully, they are looking very deeply at changing how they use their office portfolio. And we as a landlord, whereas 20 years ago might have been rather indifferent, said, well, you know, we rent out offices, we're in the business of providing a commodity, which is a box, which is an office, and we lease it to you for 30 years and we clip the coupon. We're in a very different world now, right, where we're operators of space, we're providing a service and hopefully a partnership with our tenants. And we have to, because they're not all on 30-year leases, sadly, anymore. So we can't price the product as a bond. So we have to figure out, what do our corporate occupiers want to do and how can we best facilitate that? So if it is about collaborative space, how do we create that in a cost-effective way? And how do we sort of help them navigate these times? In terms of the work that we've done, I mean, it is interesting. We reforecast the market every 6 months. This year, we've done it 3 times. And on our latest forecasts, which are hot off the press, the headline office forecasts are actually really attractive. On the vertical axis, you've got our forecast for total returns. On the horizontal, you've got an estimate of the required return. So what should you need to have given the risk inherent in that market. So if you're above the diagonal, you should be in a fair value market or a good value market. Now, offices are in dark green, and there are many gateway office markets around the world where we're saying, actually, you know what, the forecast returns are very attractive. But those are based on econometric models with input from the portfolio and asset managers that are largely based on historic relationships. In other words, for a given amount of job creation and construction, we think there will be this amount of office demand and therefore rent growth, which may or may not hold in the future, right? So there is a rightly healthy degree of skepticism about how achievable some of these office returns are. And in a sense, the listed market, as ever, has made a bit of a call on this. If you look at some of the discounting on listed office stocks, particularly in the US, it's been pretty savage and kind of in line with what's happened in the mall sector. This is an interesting chart. It shows the composition of the FTSE Nareit index. So it's a global listed real estate and infra index. And you can see that obviously, if you start at the bottom, the rise of infra and niche sectors has been rapid, including, I'm sure, cold storage now. And then you can see the sort of second from the top, which is retail, that used to make up 30 to 35% of the index, and it's now only 6% today, which I don't think surprises anybody. But what might also surprise you is if you look at the office chunk, which is the middle grey chunk, and that used to be 20, 25%, and it's also down to 6%. So the listed market's made a fairly savage judgment, which I'm not sure we would go all the way along with. In fact, there's probably some value there. But then again, we're not futurologists. We don't know how Asha and her contemporaries around the world are going to ultimately react when we are through the worst of the pandemic. So what we've tried to do is take the approach that we're going to do some scenario testing. And Andy said very rightly, it's about these two conflicting factors, right? We do know that people want to work from home a little bit more, and that when they come into the office, they want meaningful collaboration, which probably requires bigger, different space than sort of rabbit hutch open plan offices that we're all squeezed into in London. So let's just say what happens if we increase the proportion of working from home from the current level, and then what happens if we sort of decrease densification or increase space per worker, you know, to do the two offset. And we just did a bit of very simple scenario analysis on our US forecasts. And you ended up with this, which is an incredibly wide range of results for actually quite small changes in behavior, which gave us pause as an investment committee, right? Because if you've got that range of results around your base case, which is the dark green line, and you're not futurologists, you can't predict the future, that's a bit worrying. I mean, we think we're somewhere between sort of A1, B2 and A2, so where I put the yellow dash. So with B2, which is a bit more working from home, but cooler fit outs, better space, more collaboration space, you kind of end up with the same rent growth. So happy days, maybe pricing doesn't change. It might still change a little bit negatively just because leases are shortening. And the capex, right? The capex to create that space is greater. But with a very modest increase in working from home, you get to A2. You get to actually not getting back to your pre-COVID rent levels. And I guess our concern right now is we can see the logic of people working from home. Well, that's immediate. But the logic of increasing space per person, making better meeting and collaborative space costs money. And in an environment where you're pulling out of a deep recession, is that capex, is that ambition going to be there day one? We think it will be there year 5, but is it there year 1? Maybe not. So to a certain extent, we feel that, you know, the risks are to the downside. And it poses a challenge. We've started doing some work on this in the European sector. We think Europe will be different. Cities are smaller. We take public transport more, all sorts of cultural reasons why it might be different. And this is just the work from home bit. We haven't laid on the densification, but you can see from the baseline, you do start to get some quite savage falls in rent. We think you could go to up to maybe a 20 to 50% increase and get back to your pre-COVID level, but it's a really tricky one, this. It's really tricky to model, and it just means that we have to look at offices a bit like retail, where there's inherent structural change that we don't yet fully understand. Which leads us to this, very pragmatically. So the top 4 in light green are what the CIO office would be saying to the portfolio managers. You must have an absolute ruthless focus on quality, no compromise on location, and that space that you're investing in must be capable. If Asha comes to us and says, I want to create this amazing collaborative, flexible space, that it is amenable to that. And over the top of that, we need to have a focus on ESG and wellness and all the other kind of structural, functional obsolescence that was coming the way of older, crappier offices anyway. And then for me, as a head of research, the challenge to me is office going to be a bit like retail, where you have a bifurcation, where the awesome offices that Hines build that really are future-proof, the best in class, the performance, the investment returns are phenomenal. But that what we would have called good secondary actually now becomes increasingly obsolescent and really suffers. So you have this polarization of performance. Meanwhile, we do prime forecasts, we do average forecasts, and actually what we really want is a prime and a poor secondary. So that's a challenge for us. And the other challenge is how useful is, in America, they're doing metro level forecasts. That's a huge range. And we do sub-market here in Europe. Should they be asset specific? Because one could imagine that the format and location is going to be so important. So you could have a successful community town with a just nearby sort of suburban spoke office that's a flex solution that could do quite well, but it just feels like a bit like what happened to retail 5 to 10 years ago. It's going to become very granular. And that's a huge challenge to researchers, because in general, we deal in generalities, right? And historic relationships. So it's an exciting time because it just means we've really got to tear up the historic rule book a little bit and try and be a little bit more inventive in how we look at future performance. Thank you.
That was great, Sabina. That absolutely nailed it. I really liked that graph of the impact of more home working and or more space per worker. That just absolutely nails it. So I'm going to push that back to Arsha straight away and then to Ronan. So Arsha, I mean, in as far as you can share this with us, I mean, do you think firms like yours will reduce their overall demand for office space as a result of this change? And of course, the same question is heading for you, Ronan. You know, is there a sort of, is it wise to project less demand for office space than we had before 2020? So Arsha, what do you think?
So I'll say this, and many may know this, you know, a law firm is built of a partnership, and that partnership, you're putting in your own dollars, right, to invest in spaces. So that's a very different relationship. And so everything that we put into every box that we occupy in every sky around the world, how we use that space needs to be considered. What happens on a month-to-month basis before COVID is people say, and this is in the legal industry, any partnership structure, you'll find this. I see that office has been vacant for 2 months. What are we doing with it? So there's 16 different versions of that conversation that happen. There's comments about shortage of conferencing space. This is also something very common that we hear. And there's a short list. Okay, so the partnership in general, in every law firm, come mid-March, what happened? They called their heads of real estate and they said, how do we do this? How do we sit back and analyze and figure out how to have conversations with the landlords immediately? We need to reduce our footprint. We're not going to need all this space. So we all had this emotional reaction. And when that happened, people started to really think about how much space did they really need. And a lot of the individuals, and I will share this because this is across many law firms, the individuals who are more senior in their years decided to retire early because they said, there's no point, I'm not going to go through this wave. So 2 things happen. You had early retirement, you have people reevaluating, well, 3 things, and then you have the partnership really concerned about the dollars. If you configure spaces differently and still bake in your 3% growth and your 5% or your 7% vacancy, you will still come out to find that you need less space. And so that is the trajectory that we're on, because there are ways to slice and dice if you focus on the modalities of work and how you can calibrate the spaces differently. You'll find that you don't need as much space. It's about creating a Rubik's Cube of volumes within the space to justify the reduction of the footprint and still keep your growth and vacancy. I think people's greatest fears, and it happens to me, is if we cut our portfolio by 25%, have we now just shot ourselves in the foot because we will not be able to grow? Yes, you will not be able to grow in the event that you keep to the same model before COVID. But if you look at things a little bit differently and think of a partial hybrid model, and allow things to shake out naturally and holistically, look at what does performance mean? What KPIs are we actually measuring against? Okay. You'll come to find that you have the opportunity. And so that is what most of my colleagues and I are doing.
That's great, Asha. I'm going to come straight back to you and ask you about productivity in a minute. So, Ronan, sort of the same question really is are you projecting a reduction in what otherwise would have been growth in demand for offices?
So I think we should take one step back. But, pre-COVID, with the exception of some of the GAFA organizations that still experience hyper growth, most occupiers were on a multi-year program to optimize their footprint. And not only optimize the footprint, but make sure that whatever offices they were retaining were actually producing the right metrics. In other words, the right utilization, the right show-up rate, and that the people were actually having a good experience. Now, in many corporations, that wasn't the case. Many offices were 40, 50% underutilized. Okay, and that was pre-COVID. What I've learned in the last 8 months of this dialogue is actually that almost without fail, all the corporations said, we are accelerating our optimization because we have now shifted all the mindsets. We have liberated the human from that destination. Technology has been an enabler. However, we're not going to get rid of all offices. We're going to repurpose them, but equally, we're going to shift our mind into flexibility. So what proportion of the footprint can we consume as the business grows or as the business changes geographically? So I think a lot of those just been accelerated by COVID. I don't think it's a result of COVID. But overall, yes, some corporations who were on the path to reduce by 20, 30% were actually sharing with me that now it's now 50+%, especially some of the established pharmaceuticals and some of the large banks. BP was the most notable one, which I think went to the press and said, we may take out as much as 40, 50% of our global footprint. So that was really interesting. But yes, that's kind of what I've learned in the last 6 months.
Okay, question for all of us, Asha, first is do we know anything about the productivity of the productivity difference between working in an office, working at home? Now, I have to say, I'm older than all of you. I can remember times when we weren't allowed to look at the internet in the office. We weren't allowed to go onto Facebook. If somebody came and walked behind you and you were looking at BBC Sport on your PC, you felt embarrassed. And that has all gone. Now we're encouraged to, enjoy ourselves at work as much as we enjoy ourselves at home. But is there any evidence that you're aware of about the relative productivity of home working and office working?
Yes, and I think COVID has become the great clarifier. We've all been relegated to our homes. We've all been forced to look in the mirror to see how do we actually perform in these extreme conditions. There is a huge disparity between all levels of employees as they retreat back to their homes. Some have certain conditions, some do not. That has a direct impact on their productivity. Dogs on the table, kids on their backs, small confined spaces. That has an impact, and how they deal with that and those challenges really helps to clarify who they are as an employee relative to the organization. And the organization, that leadership has to really consider that. It's not just send them the technology and think that everything is going to fall in place. So the notion that productivity, performance, they can be measured the same way, I think those days are gone. Whether 100% of individuals return back to the office or not, I think that there is a expansion of how one looks at what performance means and how one looks at what productivity means. And the whole notion of operational excellence is really what's kind of guiding most industries. I think there's a reset there, just in terms of what aspects you look at to define it.
One of our researchers in the Future of Real Estate Initiative runs a technology firm where his staff basically write code, and he has measured, he can measure productivity pretty directly by the number of lines of code they write. And he's noticed a very big difference now between the number of lines written in the office and the number of lines written at home, and the number of lines written at home is underperforming the number of lines written in the office.
But this is my big issue with this, because this is not like for like. This isn't work from home versus work from office in a normal period. This is work from home during a period of heightened, constant low-level anxiety. And if you're a working young mother, for the first 3 months of it, also doing schooling, not having the help you would have had in terms of, any kind of outside help with the house. So it's not. So if you measure my productivity in May versus the office, I would argue it was horrific, because I was not just doing research. I was also a cleaner and a teacher and and a counsellor, and running at a level of anxiety about friends in hospital and family members who were dying of COVID. So, this isn't the period where we should be collecting data. The interesting period to collect data is probably next June to the following June, when sufficient people who are vulnerable and frontline workers have been vaccinated. There's a kind of a sense of normality returning. Yeah. And by the way, we up our home monitor. Then I think it's fascinating to compare.
Can I interject for a second and say, I actually think there's two data sets you need to look at. You need to look at how people respond under most extreme pressures and situations, because that data is blueprint for an organization to then potentially remap and to provide a level of support and comfort that historically companies have not. Particularly, we're under there's so much civil unrest, there are so many pressures, there are conversations that have never been had publicly. And because of COVID, now they are being forced to rise to the surface, which I think that's the first data set. And I think that is the blueprint for leadership. That is blueprint for landlords. The second data, and the second data set that you mentioned, I completely agree, is the next level to help to inform what is the future of this individual in the equation of this organization. Because, and I say this openly, and I think every one of us have experienced this, there are a lot of individuals who have taken advantage of the fact that you can work from home, right? So you're no longer put under the pressure to perform certain tasks or duties. You now have the flexibility to move things around as you wish. So there is a clarifying component here for the good and for the bad. And both of those data sets should be applied to various stakeholders.
So I completely agree, and I think one thing I like just to chime in, I agree with you, Sabina. This is working from home imposed. This is not choice, right? None of us had made a choice to be confined to our homes. It was an interesting data point from Lisman. I don't know if anybody listening to the latest release of their surveys, but what they are harvesting is actually people's perception and people's experience. And I think that, as we exit this, that is a crucial data point. People's perception of how productive they are, people's experience, how they feel is going to be a really important data point. Then you align that to hard facts. So a technology company can look at the level of engagement over technology. They can look at the lines of code. They can look at customer response, and they can begin to align that. Some of my conversations with a number of the boards in South Africa were interesting, where CEOs told me categorically, we are looking at the performance of the business. We are a big bank, we're a big insurance. We're actually looking at responses to customers. We're looking at revenue. We're looking at profitability, and we're looking at engagement of people on technology. And so far, we seem to be doing well. The business is performing. Now, when we ask people about their experience, we're trying to align that to the hard matrix that we are extracting. And they're trying to formulate what's the right balance once they exit. So I'm with you, but the interesting point, Sabina, is it's not under choice, it's under duress. But I do think that once we have choice, hopefully we'll find the happy balance for many.
Okay, I want to move on to a slightly different topic now, which is to do with the future of the city and the CBD and the sort of the difference between centrifugal forces and centripetal forces. So, we've grown up in a world where knowledge agglomeration has been the big thing, and it's made London a very valuable place to be, and Manhattan a very valuable place to be. We're congregated together in high-rise buildings because we want to be with people, sharing knowledge, becoming more valuable. Ronan, do you think there's a future for third space costs, suburban third space costs, decentralized third spaces, or is that a waste of thought?
Just listening to how large occupiers are thinking about their workforce plans and their portfolio plans, yes, I do think there will be a growing demand for a third place that is saving the commute time, that is much more caring for local communities and local economies, and it's better for the environment. And people will be looking to leverage those locations, perhaps 1 day a week, perhaps 2 days a week, just to get away from the kitchen. Maybe this will not be a permanent destination. But if I work for a big bank in Manhattan and I can access those locations in Connecticut for 1 or 2 days a week, I would probably do that rather than commuting to Wall Street. The same thing in London. I think it's really very applicable to very large, multi-million, kind of populations, as opposed to any city across Europe. At least that's my view.
Arsha, would you pay for that for your partners? Would you expect them to pay for it themselves?
Hands down, yes. The answer is yes. Yes, I'll tell you why. But just to take a step back, because I think that we have to go in, and this could be another case study we could do, Andrew. You have to look at the profiles of all the individuals and their roles in the companies, right? So it's a very general statement, right, to just say that, I think everyone would be very happy to do that. I think there's actually two modes. There's the scenario that Ronan shared, which I completely agree. The partners would jump on it. In fact, they've already asked for it. This is across every top tier law firm around the world, and it doesn't matter where they're located. The other conversation, though, and we are doing this right now, is deciding which leases to renew, not renew, and then consolidate. So there's a whole nother conversation about the new chapter of densification, where we look at our business services, our technology services, our technicians. Do they need to occupy that footprint, or can we give them back a different type of life? And could that life exist in the co-working space that is very beautifully outfitted and provides them the flexibility to do what they need to do, because they can typically do it from anywhere? And so there's a relationship there, and something that I'm going to pursue, and many of my colleagues are already pursuing it. We have been pursued by several co-working organizations to understand if we would be interested in occupying their spaces. Right now, only in affluent neighborhoods, but I think what may happen is to go into the less served communities.
Okay, I think that's the big question, really. You make the assumption that the co-working spaces are going to be available close to where your techies live.
Right.
Is a sort of a big jump. Somebody's going to have to.
That's the big conversation.
Yeah.
Big conversation to me is, do I pay someone the same? If you're doing 4 days in a suburb or a cheaper city, why do you get the London wage?
Yeah.
And that's going to be so tricky from an employment regulation. I mean, we spend so much time obsessing about what is the health and safety regulation if my German employee now works from home. But my goodness, if you start having differential wages.
Yeah. Sabina, if I'm not mistaken, some of the Silicon Valley giants have actually opened that dialogue with their employee base and said, we know you have moved to the Midwest. We know we have moved to the East Coast to stay with your parents. If you wish to stay there permanently, that's fine, but let's have a conversation about your compensation levels, because clearly, living in Austin, Texas is very different than San Francisco. So,
and then take it to the next level. If I hire a data scientist who's now in Charlotte, not in our Manhattan, next to my American head of research, why not hire one in Bangalore, right? So I think white collar workers are in for a little bit of a shock. But if you want this freedom works both ways, and it affords the corporate employer a lot of flexibility too, which I think is going to come.
I think you will find that people would be more than happy to get time back in their life than an extra $10. This is the feedback we've been receiving from other collected information from employees, from my counterparts.
Yeah, it's interesting. we're getting some great questions coming in now. I sort of want to push back on Sabina's point. I absolutely get this idea that the connection between the employer and the employee might weaken to the point where the employer says, I'm not going to pay you what I used to pay you because you're now working from home. But why wouldn't it work the other way? If I'm working from a co-working space in Connecticut 2 days a week, what is my level of loyalty to my employer?
Absolutely.
Am I more likely to become a gig worker?
And I'm not saying this is going to happen, but I think it's very easy for those of us who are enjoying doing 2 or 3 days a week at home to have a utopian view of the future. Ultimately, Ronan, Arsha, and I work in human capital businesses, right? Talent is absolutely all that we have. So the challenge is actually, how do you work with your employees who have discovered different life priorities and, oh, maybe I'm less productive as a worker, but more productive as a mum now, to make them have that flexibility, but make the office so attractive that they want to still be there. They want to see people, they feel productive there. And it's a magnet in a very positive way. So just as we as a landlord are now in partnership with our tenants to provide a service, it's the same for the employer relative to the employee, right?
Yeah.
And this is all positive. This is all great. This is all how it should have been all along.
Sabina, it's fantastic because I do agree with you. I think that we will see employers becoming much more cognizant that if I need to attract my employees back to the hub, I do want them in Manhattan 2 or 3 days a week. Therefore, that destination has to be, the best quality we can afford, full of rich amenities. It has to be a healthy building, easily accessible, hopefully in a good location that's got other things. And I do think that, back to your question, Andrew, we may see occupiers willing to pay a premium for that. So yes, they optimize the footprint, but the core strategic locations that they retain in the footprint, they will be willing to pay a premium for that because they know that it's going to be far more effective and productive for the human capital, as you described, Sabina.
And that brought me back to my research challenge, because actually sort of a Manhattan CBD office rent forecast now is meaningless because the top performing buildings will probably command such a premium, but there will be a chunk of good secondary that's kind of really redundant now.
Here's a real estate question for you, and I don't know if what your experience has been like of this, Arsha, Ronan, Sabina, but my experience has been that everybody in the office works pretty well, everybody on Zoom works okay, but a mix of Zoom and in the office is very difficult to manage. So does that mean that everybody works from home on a Friday? Question number one. And question number two, what do you do with your office space on a Friday if that's what happens?
I feel this is a challenge we've always had because we've always had people who travel very extensively in our business. So we've always had this problem of we're in the same team, we all work in London, but I haven't seen you for 2.5 weeks. And actually, I think we're going to solve that much better now because we are thinking much more about what are our office days? What are the days when we say we have to be in? And being much more conscious about creating that collaborative time, right? Whereas in the past, it was such a nightmare with travel. One of the things I'm very curious, and it's related to this, is how much business travel we'll see when things go back to normal, because I don't think it will be what it used to be.
I'm afraid we've got to wrap up now. I'm really sorry, Arsha, I'll give you the chance to say something, but it's a serious point about what you do with your office on a Friday. I mean, it may be that we start moving to an occupier-based rent at some point, so that the buildings that earn more rent are the ones that are occupied more by some measure. So this question about what you do with an empty office on a Friday is going to be pretty relevant. Arsha, did you want to say something? I don't want to cut you off.
No problem. I think this period of evaluation that we just talked about in the beginning is a sense of purpose and intentionality. I think is going to be key and central to our collective success as an occupier, as a landlord, balance is what we have to achieve. To get there, I think it's going to take many more conversations and see how things shake out in the different markets. I'll tell you, I live a hybrid work model right now, and I do not miss my office. And so I think it remains to be seen, but I certainly believe that it is critical that the spaces that you build going forward need to really be environments that provide a sense of community and connectivity. Without it, I think it will be a failure.
Yeah.
To be quite honest.
Well, I have to say,
that's it.
I do miss my office. I do miss my classroom. I miss pret-a-manger. I miss the pubs. I miss the restaurants. I miss London.
Oh no, I miss all of that. Please,
Yeah.
let me just be.
Yeah. And I look forward to meeting you guys in person one day. That would be joyful. Anyway, thank you very much, everybody, for contributing to this.
Thank you.
There will be an opportunity to see this on a video. It's on YouTube. Thanks, everybody. I hope you got as much out of that as I did. And thanks, Sabina. Thanks, Ronan. Thanks, Arsha.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.